So today's webinar is moderated by Eline Chivot, Senior Advisor on Digital Policy from the EPP. And with this, I will pass over. So please, Ms. Chivot, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to SME Europe for organizing this. And we also thank our host, Ms. Angelika Niebler, who is, of course, member of the European Parliament for the EPP Group and rapporteur for the ITRE Committee on the Data Governance Act. Welcome to this event on building a fair and trustworthy data-driven economy for the future. Now, this event will first start with you, Ms. Niebler, and your introductory statement, after which I will take the liberty to ask you a couple of questions. We're very grateful for your time. We know that you have to leave at 5:25, if I'm not mistaken. So I will let you go, and in parallel, simultaneously, we'll open the floor to our speakers, which I will introduce, and they will come up with their, they will share their opening statements, and then we'll have an interactive conversation. So Ms. Niebler, the screen is yours. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mrs. Chivot. Dear ladies and gentlemen, thanks first of all for attending this online conference. I think it's a very, very interesting topic you have chosen for today's discussion. I have to apologize that I have to leave a little bit earlier, but it's not in my hands. We have plenary session right now, you know, after the pandemic, the first time that we are all meeting again in the plenary here in the Brussels Parliament. And Justin Trudeau is coming and joining us at 4:30. So that's the reason why I have to leave a little bit earlier. I apologize for that. So building a fair and trustworthy data-driven economy for the future, as stressed, I think it's a very important topic. Why we have to deal with questions like that? I think we in the European Union, in Parliament, we learned that in the past we made some mistakes, you know, as regards personal data. I think we missed the train. You know, the digital data, personal data revolution took place somewhere else. At least, you know, we learned that all the multi-billion-dollar companies have not been established in the European Union, but outside. And most of them are based in the United States. And now everyone is talking about big data, is talking about, well, exploiting industrial data. IoT is on top of every agenda. So I think we should really not repeat the old mistake and try to do everything in order to also use industrial data, big data available in the European Union and not only outside. So that's what we learned. We made some mistakes, and then, you know, we talked a lot in the European Parliament about how to best exploit the data which are available. We had a look at, for instance, one of the studies undertaken by the German Industry Association, BDI, and they showed us that even though there are a lot of SMEs having a lot of data available, everyone is refraining from, you know, data sharing for the following reasons. 90% of companies said they are reluctant to share data because they fear unauthorized use. So they really fear not to be in line with our strict data protection rules, etc. 43% would like to use more data, but they are lacking the data which they need. And another 43% of the companies asked said it's because of technical barriers. These barriers hamper data sharing and the use of more data. So that's the analysis. So we thought, you know, when we want that a data economy is going to build up in the European Union, we have to arrange for a trustworthy environment. And if I say we, what can the European Parliament, what can a legislator do? I think the only thing we can do is, you know, encouraging, arranging for funds, trying to engage in building up infrastructure, and, you know, going for the right legal framework. And actually, that is what we did in order to repair the market and to deal, you know, to arrange for a trustworthy environment where fairness is an issue. We started, you know, regulating doing soft regulation on the data market, on the digital market. So you have been all informed or involved also when we discussed the DMA, the DSA, the DGA, and now actually the Data Act, which is on the table. and where we started in Parliament debating and discussing on that proposal. For us, it's important that there's a level playing field amongst all stakeholders involved in the digital economy. And that's why we thought, we have the big players who have a dominant position, and they are sometimes really using unfair conditions. Access to the big platforms is not easy. And for that, we thought, let's try and arrange for a sort of regulation to have a level playing field, to have fair access also to the big data platforms. That was the first thing which was in our mind in order to promote a data-driven economy here in Europe. The second is, I would say, well, creating a trustworthy environment. After achieving a level playing field, I think we need to create this environment where a data economy can truly thrive. So we did not want to copy the US nor the Chinese digital policy, but we thought we have to go for our own European way of life. And that is, first of all, that we think we have to go for regulation, as I said, smart regulation. Now the DGA comes in. Actually, that was the first legislative piece in the whole data strategy of the European Commission and the Parliament. We think, for arranging for the trustworthy environment, maybe it's possible to give a framework where neutral data intermediaries are going to offer services to, in particular, SMEs who want to share their data with others, but have some reservations in submitting, in allowing others to work with the data. So that is our idea now, to help also, moving on and giving an instrument, for companies which they can use in engaging with these data intermediaries. I have no idea as to whether this is a concept which is going to fly. We had a lot of discussions with a lot of stakeholders from all 27 member states, and we got a lot of positive response that this is the right way to move forward. But at the end of the day, this was one of the first times where we tried, to arrange for a framework, not knowing, how the market is going to develop further. So that was for us. It's an offer to the economy, to the companies in particular, to SMEs, not having strict rules, but allowing for some sort of ruling, with these data governance act, so that in particular SMEs make use of the structures which hopefully are going to be built up after we have passed this piece of legislation. Apart from that, the other second really big issue which is now on the table is the Data Act, which was presented in February this year. I think the Data Act will have wide-ranging consequences for the availability of data for the benefit of companies and for citizens. And if we do it rightly, and that is now the process in which we are at the beginning of, I think we should rebalance the negotiation power for SMEs by preventing abuse of contractual imbalances in data sharing contracts. So that's one big point. Then the Data Act should provide for new rules allowing customers to more easily switch providers of digital services, so that the data, your data, right now, if you use an Apple Watch, or any device you have, it's the provider is using your data, but not you, the owner. So I think that's very sensitive and very important for us in the Parliament. That we provide for new rules where the customer has a say in what is done with his or her data. And if you want to switch a provider, that should be easily done. We've done the same, when you reconsider what has taken place 10, 15 years ago, when everyone's starting having a mobile phone, it was very difficult, if you wanted to switch from Ericsson to Nokia or to whomever, it was very difficult to get your data transferred to the new provider. And this is exactly now true with data. So for that, I think it's good to have the proposal on data as regards the Data Act on the table. And the third issue, I think we should enable consumers and businesses to access the data of their devices or machines and use it for aftermarket and added value services like predictive maintenance, for instance. So that's also an important thing. And I think a good idea for SMEs in particular, who are specifically working in that field. So summarizing, I think the big question for us in Europe is always not over-regulating, not trying to get everything controlled and regulated. This would jeopardize, I think, innovation, new models, new ideas, which have to progress. So finding the right balance between openness on the one hand side, allowing for innovation, and regulation in order to have a sort of framework in which you know where you can cope. And in particular, a framework which is arranging for fairness also in the digital economy. That is, I think, the big challenge laying ahead of us when we discuss specific rules on the Data Act. Finally, let me also come to another important thing. We talked 2 years ago when we started this legislative term, we talked a lot about digital sovereignty. So nowadays we have completely other issues on the table when we look what's happened in the Ukraine now. But sovereignty, getting more resilient in Europe, it's the topic. It's really the topic until the end of our term. And as regards digital sovereignty, you've learned that with the CHIPS Act, with the secure connectivity proposal from the Commission, with the further rollout of 5G, etc., a lot of proposals are coming on the table. When we decided for the first time in the European Union to borrow money on the market in order to help member states coping with the COVID-19 situation, passing the MFF and the RRF, the Resilience and Recovery Fund, we also arranged for a lot of money that has to be spent into digitalization of the economies in the member states. So this is what we do apart from legislation, that we try also with money being available on the European level to initiate that structures are built up, that we are getting more resilient, in particular in the digital world. And coming to my final point, if you have a look at the Data Governance Act, you will read about data spaces which are going to be built up in Europe. I'm happy about this idea, that we have a common health data space, that we have a common transport data space, that culture people and industry are going to share the data and work together and develop further things. Yeah, but the big question here again is, please, and that's what we prevented, EPP group prevented in the Parliament, that we do not start regulating data spaces in detail. That would be the absolutely wrong approach. I say, let's provide for a soft sort of framework, but not getting into really clear regulation. I think in the digital world, so many things are happening, so many new ideas are coming up. No one knows what's going to be the front runner next year in products and services in the digital field. So please, I think for us politicians, we like to pass legislation, yeah, but sometimes doing less is the better way to proceed. So thanks. That's what I wanted to stress. A lot of things needed to be said. Excuse me really for not entering into further detail. I'm happy to answer some questions, Mrs. Chivot. But again, sorry for getting out earlier, Ukraine. And I can tell you as of the 24th of February, we have no other topic on the agenda. We try to do our job properly, but all our hearts are with the people in Ukraine, and learning how dependent we are as regards energy, as regards food, as regards our digital landscape. We are really having a lot of things to do, and that's why I apologize for not being able to stay during the whole discussion now with you. And now I give back to Mrs. Chivot. Thank you.
No, thank you so much for sharing your work and updates. I think this packed a punch, and we perfectly understand that you have a busy schedule at the moment. It's great that you reminded us also why we're talking about trust and the importance of data. What does that really mean? And that, you know, a lot of companies want to share data, but sometimes they, you know, there's a lack of trust, there's a lack of access to data, and that needed to be addressed. So sometimes words have a meaning, but we forget the meaning. It's the same with digital sovereignty. You've rightly mentioned that the current context has an implication for the resilience of our infrastructure, for even our digital strategies. That they've taken on a new importance, but we have to look at them again and with a new kind of pair of eyes. So thank you for all of that. As I mentioned, you've covered quite a lot. So I wanted to ask you maybe a question that I know many people in the Brussels crowd like to ask you. Well, you've mentioned the Data Act, and you've been the rapporteur on the Data Governance Act. I was wondering perhaps if you could tell us more on how you think these two complement each other, and then how the discussions, how do you expect the discussions will go in Parliament with the legislative process and the negotiations, so that it goes into the right direction? And maybe if you know more about who may want and jump on the file.
So thanks for the question, and well, that's very interesting. Who is going to work on what dossiers? So actually, as regards the Data Act, this is one of the most important acts where I think I learned that yesterday we had the coordinators meeting, and you know, the files have been distributed amongst the political groups. It's not yet decided who is going to work on which file in what political group. But if I'm right, I have my parliamentary assistant with me, Ferdinand, who is joining you later on when I'm leaving. I think the Data Act is going to us. Good. The CHIPS Act will not be with us. The CHIPS Act will go to I think to the SND group, and Renew wants to work on the secured connectivity file, but the Data Act is with us. So. And if you ask me, I can only tell you that a lot of colleagues, including myself, are interested in becoming the rapporteur of the Data Act, because this is a crucial piece of legislation. If you ask me how that fits together with the Data Governance Act, I think it's, well, the scope of inhalt. The scope of the content is a completely different one, actually. So when looking at the Data Governance Act, it's the more or less, it's the one big issue is how we arrange for data being public service data being more easily, you know, brought into the market, being used, being shared by others. That is governed by the Data Governance Act, together with, you know, the concept of giving the framework for neutral intermediaries. So that was, you know, that is basically the content of the Data Governance Act, whereas, you know, in the Data Act, you have the specific questions on, you know, how you deal with how the providers are going to, what's about, who is going to share, who is the owner of the data, so to say, to whom belong the data, who has a right in using, to what extent the data, etc., etc. So that is, and finding here the right balance on a not on a sectoral basis. You know, you know that Commission is planning also to come forward with a Health Data Act later on this year, during the year. But you know, getting for this overall over the sectors lying regulation, I think that's quite a difficult thing to do. But the proposal we have on the table now, I think it's a very interesting, a good one. Of course, we have to work on details, but from the beginning, you know, from the structure, I think it's quite okay to make this holistic approach now with the Data Act. So maybe that is answering your question. So that are the different focuses of the two pieces of legislation. And again, Data Act will be in EPP hands, and who is going to work on it? I think a lot of colleagues will do that.
Thank you very much. I'd like to bring you in further on because you mentioned let's not repeat previous mistakes, and you mentioned smart regulation, and you know, there are concerns over European frameworks either in force or under deliberation that could potentially compete or overlap. So I was wondering if you could comment a bit more on what does that mean for potential interplay between regulations and vertical sectoral rules, like in health and mobility, in automotive. And I'm thinking also a bit about the secondary use of health data. It's controversial, but it's crucial for research purposes. But if you look at the GDPR, the use of secondary use of data, it's quite unclear. So how do you expect the Data Act could perhaps address this? Or
that's a very complicated question, honestly, and it's very difficult for me to answer because, you know, looking back at the discussions we had on the DGA, you know, for some colleagues in the Parliament, it was the key question that, well, moving forward on the DGA does not mean changing any GDPR rule, and we didn't change GDPR rules by working on the DGA, and I think. That will also be the case as regards the Data Act. Because if we start talking about data protection and trying to amend the rules by using, you know, the Data Act as the instrument to do this, we will have a never-ending story in the European Parliament. So I think better not to address it, or in other words, clarify that GDPR is not changed by the Data Act. And trying to use the room which we find in the GDPR, you know, also using for the sharing models of the data economy. I think that's the best way to do. And if you look into the sector-specific regulation, you have a very valid point, Mrs. Chivot. You know, how is our sector regulation coping with other regulation? Theoretically, I cannot tell you how we are going to find the right approach on that. I think the most important thing is that we are aware of, you know, having all these different regulations and layers. You know, we have quite the same discussion right now. We work on Fit for 55, so we work on sustainability. Achieving climate neutrality goals in a lot of different sectors, and all these sectors, transport, industry, energy, everything is already heavily regulated. So we work on renewable directive, we work on energy efficiency, we work on more efficiency in the buildings, and we work on ETS. Also for buildings and for transport, but that's already regulated. So that's always the same question. And the thing we are doing in our EPP group is that we coordinate all people working on the dossiers and trying to prevent actually that we have an overlapping or that we have contradictions in the approach on regulation. So it's not a systematic thing. It's not that when working on the directive or the regulations that you look at the scope of application and take things out and allow things to be in, but it's a case-by-case approach. But we all, and that's why it's really important to make that point, we all have to really carefully consider that we are not in sum, you know, at the end of the day, having such a huge workload regulation in place that in particular SMEs do not know at all what they should care of, what they should look at. So this is that's a big challenge, but we should be aware of the problem, and I can reassure you that, you know, the EPP group, we take it really serious, and we invite all, you know, all colleagues really working on these dossiers to agree on a common line.
No, thank you very much for your time, Ms. Niebler. It's true that the EPP has the SMEs at the heart of its DNA, so I trust you'll do great work again on this. Wishing you good luck with the rest of your day. And thanks again for joining us, and see you soon.
Mrs. Chivot, thank you so much. And well, I'm so unfortunate that I cannot join the further discussion, but Mr. Ferroli, my head of office, is now joining you. He was the key person in dealing with the DGA as well. So day and night, he worked for months on the DGA. So whenever any other question is pumping up, please ask him. He's the expert, I can tell you. So thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. And welcome to Ferdinand and for accepting to be grilled a bit, but I will move to our other speakers. I'd like for us to keep in mind a little bit, we don't have a lot of time, but those trade-offs that are around those questions that we've already tackled through Ms. Niebler's intervention. How do we, balance, when we look at these proposals, how do we balance enabling SMEs and their competitiveness versus enacting obligations for larger EU companies? How do we strengthen our single markets actors while maintaining our openness for global trade and the flow of data? How do we achieve our ambition of increased data availability and access while addressing the costs potentially and the risks for emerging business models and existing business models? Now, I have the pleasure to have with me four panelists. Thank you very much for accepting this invitation. First off will be Anna Buchta, Head of Units on Policy and Consultation with the European Data Protection Supervisor. Then we have Kimon Zorbas, Head of Public Policy at DATEV, which is a European software and IT services provider, so solutions to improve business processes with tax advisors, auditors, lawyers, businesses, a lot of SMEs. We have Vera de Mari, who's Head of the Research Unit for Digitalization, Structural Change and Competition at the German Economic Institute of Cologne. And last but not least, Carina Stan, who is Director of EU Policy at the Developers Alliance, a trade association that many of you may know, that supports software developers, that includes many startups and SMEs. So I'll give the floor to you first, Anna, for your opening statements.
Thank you very much, Aline, and good afternoon, good evening, almost everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to take part in today's discussion. I have to say, at first I was a bit doubtful whether this, does not overstate the importance of GDPR and personal data in this whole discussion, because obviously data as a resource, as an economic asset, is a vast topic and largely broader and bigger than the subset, which is personal data. But I think Ms. Niebler was already quite clear that the GDPR is often the elephant in the room, and I think there is quite a few misunderstandings and issues to clarify around that as well. So I'm happy to answer any questions that might arise in this respect. Then maybe for the audience also, just to quickly explain, as the EDPS, the European Data Protection Supervisor, companies, businesses, SMEs are not really part of our jurisdiction when we enforce the data protection regulations for EU institutions, bodies, and agencies. But what we also do, we advise the Commission, we advise the Parliament and the Council through opinions on legislative proposals which can have a bearing on personal data processing and protection. And in the case of the DGA, Data Governance Act, well, its importance was already very well explained by Mrs. Niebler, and in the broader context as well. The Commission considered that the potential high impact on data protection, if this is not done properly, was so high that it consulted both the EDPS and the European Data Protection Board, so the body that brings together all the national supervisory authorities for data protection, or DPAs. And so we issued a joint opinion on the proposal, which was not entirely positive at the time, I have to say. But then what followed, both from the side of the Council, but in particular in the Parliament, we saw as a very constructive negotiating process that attempted to really make sure that we create as much legal certainty as possible, and that the interplay or interaction between these two instruments, being GDPR and the DGA, would be as clear as possible. And I believe that this is really important, because indeed, if we aim to create trust, then respect for fundamental values is a very obvious starting point. And then GDPR in its imperfect way, with all its disadvantages that there might also be in relation to red tape, or as any compromise on a difficult subject, it's imperfect, but it's the best we could get as a result of this process at EU level. It is an expression of these values, and I think I would completely agree with what was said before, that in Europe we need to unleash the power of data. We need to build our own strong data-based economy, but we really need to do it our own way. So we should not aspire to outperform China on surveillance, and we should also not repeat the mistakes that equate exploitation of data with innovation, and that gave us Cambridge Analytica and this kind of aberrations, I would call it. So while the GDPR is a baseline setting certain boundaries, you also, Eline, mentioned earlier that it opens or leaves certain issues open, either for further regulatory action, or requires or allows implementation at national level. And it also, in its basic principles, speaks of transparency, users' rights, of course, but requires a legal basis for any data processing. And here, those legal bases, quite often people think, oh, it must be consent, it's only consent. No, it can be many other things. It can also be tasks performed in the public interest, or it can be a legal obligation. And there are also specific provisions which allow the legislator to, at EU level or nationally, to introduce further limitations or restrictions, to say that in certain circumstances, the data sharing or publishing is so important that specific rights of the data subjects could be curtailed or limited within certain limits. So the GDPR is, in fact, a very flexible instrument, and it is useful and sometimes even necessary to complement it with other instruments that would provide for clearer, more specific rules. For example, how to share data for public good purposes. And so this is how we see these initiatives from the Commission, starting with the DGA. Now we are also looking, of course, at the Data Act, which has a slightly different focus. And I have to say that, at least for the DGA, I think the glass is half full. So indeed, in terms of the basic approach, this may sound like a technicality, but starting from the definitions and the terminology which is being used, and then moving on to aligning to a large extent the data altruism concepts and implementation with consent under the GDPR, using the preamble, the recitals, to explain in greater detail how these two should interact, and also responding to some of the requests that we have done, some more technical requests that we have done as EDPS and EDPB throughout the instrument. I believe it really sets a good basis for seamless, let's hope, as seamless as possible coexistence for these two instruments in actual practice. Because after all, I think especially for smaller enterprises, for those businesses who do not have unlimited resources to pay lawyers and consultants, it is of crucial importance to have certainty as to what the law actually requires from them. And I think we are certainly not there yet in all cases for the GDPR, adding the DGA on top or in addition to that is not likely to simplify things, but at least I believe we have here a good basis to take it forward with the further implementing legislation, rather delegated acts that will be adopted with the European Data Innovation Board, which will bring relevant stakeholders together and can issue guidance with the involvement of the EDPB in developing certain forms and templates in relation to the data altruism. I think we have a solid basis how to take it forward, but of course we'll have to see, verify in practice how that works.
Thank you for sharing those rich insights. I have a quick follow-up question, because you mentioned the interaction of regulations, right? I was wondering if the GDPR conference in June plans to discuss this or to take this into consideration.
Well, yes, indeed. The EDPS is organizing a conference on the 16th and 17th of June in Brussels on the broad theme of GDPR enforcement. And I have to say that we are also going to look into what we see as the multiplication of the various regulatory frameworks in the digital sphere, because it's not only DGA and now the Data Act and soon the European Health Data Spaces and the follow-up. We also have the more competition related and the platform regulation with the Data Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act. But what we will be doing during this conference will be more with the focus on the interaction of the various acts at a higher level, and also the enforcement or the governance frameworks and how those should be interacting. So we will probably not be looking, at the very nitty-gritty details, how the legal basis with the GDPR squares with whatever provision and the other acts, but we will try to take a helicopter view and look at how the governance models of those various instruments compare, and whether there would be any room and a scope for streamlining or learning from what works already, and bringing these lessons to the future, and hopefully the Parliament and the Council, as they go along, discussing those different and finalizing those different pieces of legislation which are still pending or forthcoming, could already try and maybe go towards maybe not a completely uniform, identical, but at least compatible, consistent way of applying and enforcing those, both at national level and at European level. Because what we see so far is, a great deal of creativity on the side of the Commission, coming up with a slightly different approach and division of competences and powers between national level, among the different national authorities, national and European, and different types of governing bodies, of enforcers at European level. All of that in itself, we believe, is problematic and will create many problems for the future, even without looking at to what extent, all the substantive provisions are fully compatible or have also a potential for conflict written into them. So certainly there will be some discussion of those issues as well.
Thank you very much, Anna. Now I'm going to turn to you, Kimon. You've heard a lot maybe that inspired you. Of course, your work with SMEs. So we're talking about the conditions for a fair and trustworthy ecosystem and data economy, but also, what does that mean, and how do you see it develop, and what do we need, and what should we avoid so that we get to a healthy, growing ecosystem in Europe? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. Let me just explain briefly who DATEV is, and because we're everything but an SME ourselves. We are over 8,000 people, but we are very peculiar in a sense that we are cooperative, and we are owned by accountants, lawyers, auditors that by themselves, mostly, to the vast majority of them, are actually SMEs themselves. And we are primarily serving, not also, but primarily serving SMEs. So if you just look, for example, Germany is our largest market. We have also activities in other EU markets, but if we just look at Germany, there's over 3 million SMEs, over 3 million companies, actually 99% are almost SMEs. And of those, we have data from about 2.5 million. So we are an integral part of the system, and we see the challenges. So I'm coming from a company here that is highly regulated, because all these professions are highly regulated. The data they produce or the data they have as trustees, so to say, do fall under professional secrecy obligations. So part of it might not even be covered by GDPR, but it is covered beyond, so to say. And I have been previously working, and DATEV was founded in 1966. So we are working with data all the time since 60 years. And I used to work before with another company, Nielsen. I just mentioned this because that company is almost 100 years old and was also set up to deal with data in a completely unregulated area. It was about market research. And you see there's two companies here that are rather old, that have been dealing with data, and the one in a completely regulated environment, the other in an unregulated environment. And I think what we see is that data has been out there since even before Joseph was on a trip to get the census done and little Jesus was born on the way. So this is all data driven, really, if you want, in a sense. And we are now, I think, entering into a phase where the transition of the ordinary economy into a data driven economy, as I call it, is happening. And that leads to a number of misconceptions and misunderstandings. Very often the power of data is overestimated. And I think also politicians are put under pressure to provide a framework to help that transition. But to a degree, I believe it is a bit of an unfair pressure they have. And we also see this avalanche on legislation. And I think it really started with GDPR, and I completely agree with Anna that it is a burden for many people to really understand. And I think the fact that many lawyers and consultants don't make it easy to win money is probably a big factor in it. However, I think this is just the environment to scope it. And there is this idea, and I think politicians want to really help, but on the other side, I think we are lacking a bit of an innovation. I don't know. I'd say hunger for innovation in Europe, right? We always think that the legislators are going to fix an issue, or the problem is we can't share data in a trustworthy environment, or it isn't protected enough. And the politicians try to somehow provide a framework, but a framework is just a framework. You need to fill it with life. And I think this is where we currently are. So when you're asking us, what do SMEs need? I do think that SMEs need simple frameworks, and most than anything, they need a win-win case scenario. And why do I say a win-win? Because usually in the data sharing environments we see, and I think that applies to every single one of us when we use Google, we may put a question mark on the exchange here, but fundamentally we're getting something for free, but we're providing something. And so we feel there is an equilibrium. Some feel it isn't. But fundamentally, when you're taking data from somebody who has entrusted you the data, particularly in our area where it is, under the legal framework of professional secrecy, you need to be very careful. So when you come up with a framework, you need to make sure that everybody has something out of it. So just taking the data, trying to run with it and make money is not going to make it. So you need to provide some insights. You need to provide an added value. And this is when you can actually help help create something new. And then I would say the legal considerations are completely secondary, because if I feel I can trust you, you're going to use the data the way you are supposed to, then I'm more willing to give it to you. So here is, of course, we as a company having this old history, having this very regulated environment as well, but also having very strict safeguards ourselves, are very, very, very careful with what we do with data. And this is why also people trust us. So we do have a trust. And so if we are to use the data, we can benefit of this trust. However, we also need to make sure that this trust is maintained. And for me, this is really the key question for SMEs. So you need to make it simple for SMEs, and you need to make them, to give them a safer they can trust. I think politicians have done this with the DGA to a degree, and I say to a degree because there is a question whether you need a third party to just pass on data that somebody trusts and they do nothing else than passing it further on. But that can work in certain environments. In our environment, I'd say we might want to do this as a company, but we do also feel like we have the trust. So if we come up with our business model on data for SMEs, we will use it. But what I see here is like this trust is a bit put on jeopardy with what we see now in the Data Act, particularly when it comes to B2G sharing. And this is one of the last remarks I want to make. We do understand that governments need data. And I think every company in the pandemic wanted to help. And every company, or a lot of companies, provided data. In my previous job, we did it also, and it was seriously interesting to see how different governments across Europe saw a different value in pretty much the same data sets we were willing to provide for free. However, I think when we have a framework put out by the Commission that says any exceptional need under the blue sky is fit enough to require data, then we do have a problem, because we do need some legal solid framework around it. We have data that's entrusted to us, that is data we process under GDPR terms as a processor. It is not our data. So the owner, shouldn't he know about it? Shouldn't you first run to the owner? Or because SMEs are accepted somehow, you just go to the aggregator, or that's how we might be viewed, and you just get it from Dativ instead of the SMEs. That's a problem. Particularly data that falls under professional secrecy, that's another problem. We're not here to say, we don't want to share any data with the government, but we do need a bit of a more solid framework. And I do also think that there's a misconception on how the data world works, right? The framework that is asked for has some ideas. It's easily to depersonalize. I use deliberately this term. We have huge issues actually using anonymous data, because that is part of the problem of the framework of GDPR, that is reacting to a technological reality, that it is indeed easy to re-identify individuals when you have few data sets. So there is like a question here, and okay, guys, what do you want? Do you want anonymous data, or do you want us to hand you over non-anonymous data? So I think there is a few bits and pieces we need to fix. We need some legal safeguards, but altogether we are not opposed to handing over data to the government when there is a need, such as the pandemic or the war. And I think we have also seen, Anna mentioned few horrible scenarios like Cambridge Analytica. We can also see the power of data in the pandemic. We all owe a lot to Israel making data available in the pandemic on how the vaccines work. And we can also see the power of data when we are able to track what is happening in the Ukraine. So power is in data, but we need to make sure we use it in a meaningful setup.
Thank you very much, Timon. That was very interesting, and I could see a lot of your, several of your fellow panelists nod. Thanks for pointing to the lack of hunger for innovation in Europe. I guess some say that we don't like risks, like we don't have a very risk-taking culture very much. And thanks also for raising those issues related to gaps between reality and legislations in a practical way. We have 2 interventions left, 10 minutes left, but don't worry, I will make sure that you have the time you need. We may go a little bit over time, but please, our next panelist is Vera De Mari. Please do take the time you need. I just wanted to remind our guests that you are head of the research unit for digitalization at the German Institute, Economic Institute in Cologne. Please.
Thank you very much. Originally, I wanted to show some slides, which I'm going to not do now. Instead, I'm going to try to tie together 2 thoughts that previous speakers mentioned that I think are worthwhile talking about. One is the thought of trust that is especially valid for SMEs. And then Kimon just mentioned several times the need that SMEs have for a framework that is simple. And I'm just going to take a couple minutes to tell you why we need both this framework and why we need trust for SMEs, because SMEs are different than other companies, as you all know, I'm sure about that. What we did at the German Economic Institute is we did a survey among German companies from industry and industry-related services late last year on their data economy readiness. So the way in which they save and collect data, the way in which they manage data, the way in which they use data for several purposes. And we determined the percentage of companies that are, so to speak, data economy ready, that are able to handle their data accordingly, that are able to make use of their data in products and services. Overall, 29% of these German companies are data economy ready. That's quite good. It's more than we had in previous surveys, but that also means that 71% of the companies are not data economy ready, meaning sometimes they don't even have digital data. They're not able to manage them with a governance framework, for example, or they're not able to use them for efficient purposes, for example. What we also see is a large divide between SMEs, especially small companies, and then medium-sized and large companies on the other hand. Small companies are particularly bad at dealing with data, at least in this German sample, meaning that 72% of small companies with up to 49 employees are not data economy ready. And among the medium-sized and larger companies, so 50 employees plus, it's only about 50% that are not there yet. And this is something we need to consider, because when we're talking about the data economy, we're implicitly saying we need mostly non-personal data from companies. We need data from businesses for this to work. We need businesses to be open to exchanging data with each other, to use the data spaces that we talked about earlier. And if they can't do that, or if they're not willing to, the whole system will not work. So it's very, very important that we get everyone on board, especially the small companies, because they are also less likely to share data. About 27% of the companies that we asked in our sample, of the small companies we asked, are sharing data, meaning they either take data from external sources and use them somehow in their processes, or they supply others with their own data. So 27% of them versus about 40% of medium-sized and large companies. So they're behind there as well. You have to consider, though, that data sharing is sort of the Premier League of the whole data economy. So this is not something that everyone needs to do to a huge extent, but this is something that you need to have all your processes in shape. You need to be able to really work with data to be able to do this, to be able to share data with others. So it's worthwhile thinking about how to get smaller companies to the point where they might actually consider doing this. And we heard about the obstacles to this. That is trust, a lack of trust in your business partners, a lack of trust in the infrastructure, a lack of trust in the legal framework, or a lack of knowledge of the legal framework. And this is something that Anna talked about earlier. So we need to fix all this. We can have the best legal framework if no one knows what it means and how to comply with it. Companies are going to hold back. And this is a problem for all of the EU. And I'm just going to leave it at that. So Karina will have more time. I just wanted to make these couple points because I think they're very important that we take everyone on board with a communication that's easy to understand. I'm adding on that what Kimon already said. We need it to be easily understandable for everyone. We need everyone to know what they're dealing with, what the requirements are, and it needs to be simple. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vera. Would have loved to ask you some questions about your work on China's digitalization strategies and digital policy and how it can impact Europe, but this will be maybe for another panel. But just so that everyone knows, Ms. Demari has done extremely interesting work in that space and others. Now, last but definitely not least, Karina Stan of Developers Alliance. Now, you can draw a lot on what your fellow panelists have said, I'm sure. Please, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, a lot have been said and a lot of interesting things that I also agree with. So from us, data access, data sharing, these are prerequisites for software developers, for their business success. And I'm speaking about, because my mission is linked to those developers that are business users. Yeah, we are thinking about a data act that is, focusing on business users, but also startups, the ambitious digital entrepreneurs, but also developers as partners of large companies from different sectors, not only big tech. And of course, we see the data strategy and in particular the two legislative proposals with a little bit of skepticism, because there is this impression from our side that they set a convoluted framework for the data economy in the EU that might not achieve the proposed objectives of the data strategy. And Mrs. Buchta already said that adding the DGA and the Data Act is not going to simplify things. And basically, we think that why we are so skeptical about not achieving the proposed objectives of the data strategy, because basically the approach is based on two main flawed premises. First of all, it's an overstated role of raw data in creating value. One needs more than data. We need innovation, disruptive innovation. This is the investments, skills. Data in itself is not so valuable. Also, it has particular, it is not a traditional asset. As we know, it has its characteristics, special characteristics. And the value is created based on the ability of businesses to transform the data, the raw data, in information and knowledge. And the second flow is about the interventionist approach to artificially relocate market shares and to direct the development of the digital markets. And we think the data economy cannot be boosted while avoiding the root causes of the barriers for digital entrepreneurs in the EU. And I had my talking points with some points on both proposals. On the DGA, I will just go very quick through them.
Please go ahead.
It's a lot to talk about, of course. On the DGA, very quick, because the text is almost adopted. But I will just mention that the implementation, we cannot expect that it will be consistent across the member state, because it depends on the level of digitalizations of the public administrations of the member states. And also the technical expertise at the member states level is very important, and in applying specific data protection techniques and ensuring secure storage of the data and processing the data. And we think that here guidance from the DPAs in each member state is essential. And this is also, I think, valid for the debate on the Data Act, I think, and linking with the Data Act a little bit on enforcement, I think we should question also, you know, the role of authorities in each member state. What role will have the DPAs, for example? And because I already passed to the Data Act, we strongly recommend the principle of voluntary data sharing and respecting for B2B, business to business sharing and based on contractual freedom. We think that a mandated sharing of data assets between private actors, this could inhibit the commercial incentive to innovate within the EU. And also there are a lot of areas that are unclear legally, but also from a technical point of view. First of all, we need to acknowledge that it's very difficult to separate personal from non-personal data and industrial data. That's only one example of how complex the debate on the Data Act will be. There's a lot to unpack. Just to mention other areas, so the correlation, it was already mentioned also by Mrs. Niebler, the correlation with the other pieces of legislation. I would add here as a call to the EU policymakers to pay attention to conflicting objectives of this between different, because on one side we need to boost the data exchanges, but on the other side we have proposals and provisions in those proposals that are limiting, restricting a lot data access and then we have, of course, from a legal point of view, Mrs. Buchta also mentioned the definition of data, and I would say other notions, the extent to, you know, to the access to data, and we can have, you know, real life situations where it could be very complicated. Access on front terms, we know that could be very complicated, and also the conditions for business to government data sharing. It was mentioned before, the purposes of data processing, how to respect GDPR, conditions of smart contracts. I think that's another area where the policymakers will have a lot of work to do. I will quickly mention this because I think it's very, very important, is the strong data management and security practices. These are key elements in defining the legal and the technical framework for data sharing of any kind, and also for interoperability and strengthening resilience in the area of cybersecurity. That's a common effort. It's not only for public authorities, it's the involvement of private actors also, software developers, companies of any size. And also I would mention standardization, which plays a key role in ensuring interoperability. But I guess that's another topic for another entire event. I'll just conclude that the data strategy raises another layer of complexity in the EU regulatory landscape, and this is always translated in cost of doing business, and it's an impedance to innovation processes. And our skepticism, I repeat, is mainly related to the proposed approach. We think that data-driven ecosystems that are natural, created by the free market, they represent the sole viable economic solution to reap the benefits of the digital economy. And unfortunately, we see that these two pieces of regulation, they lack the commercial incentives, which are essential for the viability, for the success of any economic system in the end. And I forgot to say about, I think that's another elephant in the room, is the data localization, an entire topic for another event, of course.
Thank you so much, Karina. I very much regret that I wasn't very good with time keeping, but I thought it was important to make sure that at least you would each get a chance to get your messages communicated, given you've prepared this event. So thank you very much to each of you for sharing those messages, and I hope you're happy with the way you've managed to get them to come across. Now, yeah, we discussed a lot of things. Of course, we haven't mentioned also a lot of other things, like how do we get the Data Act, how we identify whether or not it applies to certain kinds of data, distinguishes, for instance, between product data, user generated data. And thank you for mentioning also that this complexity that seems to come back as an element of the EU landscape in this discussion, and whether we have the resources and the expertise to deal with that complexity. Thanks also for those who mentioned the importance to involve industry and their expertise. And also, Karina, you've very well pointed out to cybersecurity and how having strong data and security practices are so important for the resilience of our infrastructure of the data economy, and therefore for actors to trust it. We didn't even get to talk about how we can make sure that people understand and harness those new tools that the data economy is providing them, or at least legislators in some ways. And we, of course, didn't tackle another element in the room, which is the transatlantic data flows regime, which in its absence, it's quite important to make sure that that clarity happens at some point, so that our data economy can thrive, because it's not just European, it's a global one we're talking about. So I'd like to thank everyone again once more. Thank you for your time, and thank you to SME Europe for organizing this event. I hope to see you in person very soon, and it will be with great pleasure. Thank you very much.